on both sides as we go through, whether it's adjacent to a roadway, through an open field is going through, it still has the same basic construction as going through. And as you can see on the right is an example of the Clear Creek Trail shared use path, the Silverdale. And some other examples, the two on the right are from Bainbridge Island. And so our project schedule, our schedule has changed a little bit since the last open house. We've extended the project. The tier 1 analysis, with doing over 60 segments, it took longer than we anticipated. And so we modified our program to do more extensive analysis in the tier 1. And then that's why we're pushing it out. So the project will be pushing out till about August for the next public meeting and the screening of our 3 alternatives that we're going to present today. In our first open house, we went through the planning history and the project context, that how this is the Sound Olympics Trail we're looking at and how to go forward. We introduced the planning process, and we introduced and got feedback on the preliminary trail segments. Ultimately, we went to approximately 60 segments that we analyzed in this. All of them are on the project web page, and an interactive map that allows you to look at all the segments and all the different layers, all the different types of information we're looking at, from planning level documents and interpretations to environmental, what type of environmental data we're using, to property ownership, to streams, to forests, to all of these are on there. It allows you to click through on different layers to look at how you would assess these projects as we go through. Looking at the segment, looking at the topography or the slopes of the land, and then analyzing each one of the segments. We also work with our working group members on environmental criteria, our evaluation criteria, which includes environmental elements as we go through. And they helped us work through and try and finesse the layers. So we have a tier 1 analysis, which is predominantly qualitative as part of that. As we move into the tier 2, we'll be picking up a couple more criteria. It's shifting more to a qualitative analysis as we go through and do more detailed analysis on the different segments of the line segments as we move forward. And this is I went through all that. Let's go through. So we are looking at the alignments, the segments, based on the concept of connecting communities, parks, open space, and utilizing the work that was done by the community. Because one of the questions, why are we here? It's because over the last 10, 15 years, the community has been asking us to advance this project, to advance the connectivity between the parks, access to the parks, access to the communities, and access to the open space. And as we work forward, we work with the communities, with the string of pearls, integrating that into our non-motorized plan of the county, and also doing feasibility studies on Port Gamble, and also on the divide block between Miller Bay Road and Port Gamble roads, to advance and find out. And that's the rationale why we're here today, is also to continue to advance them. Knowing that, no planning document is perfect. It can always be improved as you move forward. And that's what we're looking at. How can we improve? Some of the examples that we showed in the last was on Port Gamble, where we took the pearls alignment and we looked at it on the ground, analyzed the best ways to go through, the least impact, the most desirable, and came up with a different alignment on some elements that came through. And that's what we're doing here. So how do we fulfill the need, the purpose that was envisioned in the Sound Olympics within the environment we have today as we move forward? And so Jeff is going to come up and start walking you through some of our tier 1 data where we did that. We looked at the segments that we came to you and talked to you about. There's over 60 segments, did analysis, and put those together. And now we're trying to read that analysis and bring it forward to how do we advance the concept and find the best way and the ultimate ways of connecting the communities, parks, and the open space.
Okay, I think it's on. Thanks. My name is Jeff Bama. I'm a landscape architect and a trail planner with Fisher Valley Partnership, one of the consultants groups working with the county on this project. Thanks to David for giving us a little bit of background on the project, the goals, some of the logistics. Most of tonight, we're going to be talking about two main topics, or I'm going to be talking about two main topics. The first one is the planning process. I'll spend most of the time on that. The second thing is the second thing are the results. So basically, what alignments are we going to look at in more detail in the phase 2 analysis? Just as a reminder, you heard David mention 60 segments we had originally identified. This is the project area, and we divided it into 3 different zones, the west, the central, and the east. You'll see in a bit, that's important because to really understand what the 3 proposed options are, it's better to zoom in and look at those enlargements. The west zone being from Port Gamble Forest Heritage Park to Miller Bay, which is that first yellow line on the left. The central zone between the yellow lines encompassing North Gazette Heritage Park, and the east zone from the east side of the park, Norman Road to downtown Kingston. We spent some time in the field over the summer and fall, the consultants as well as the county working group. For me, this is the best part of these projects, so I've got to throw in a couple slides of us out in the field. The one on the left, most of you are probably familiar with Beaver Pond on the east side of North Gazette Heritage Park. The one on the right, I believe, is on the divide block property heading towards Great Peninsula Conservancy land, which is that row of trees in the background. That's heading southeast down towards Forseth Road, where A&L Topsoil is located. Since the last public meeting, we've finalized the evaluation criteria that we used to screen the 60 segments, different trail segments. Those were divided into 5 categories, including providing access to communities, parks, and open spaces. There are 4 criteria, specific criteria for that. 6 for environmental, 2 for safety, health, and function, 3 for user experience, and 2 for project delivery. We'll go through some of the specific criteria in each one of those categories in a moment. For each of those categories, we had to determine what constituted, say, a high, medium, or low rating for each one of those. And that was determined based on the level of impact or the outcome associated with that criteria. You'll see some examples of that. There we go. So I don't know if you noticed when you first came in, there were these big spreadsheets taped on the wall. This is actually just a small little snapshot of the corner of one of those. And I want to go through this with you just to give you an idea of the framework of this ratings table that we created. We created this table for the ratings in order to organize both the criteria and the ratings for each one of these segments. This is an example for the first category of criteria, which is connecting communities, parks, and open spaces. Each of the specific criteria you can see are in the first 2 columns. There's 4 specific criteria for this category. For each one of those, we developed a more detailed description of that criteria to describe it. We also determined the metrics, like I mentioned for that, the metrics for rating, so what constitutes a highly low or high, medium, or low rating for that. And then we also, to keep track of things, listed the basis of rating. So did we use GIS data? Did we use field study? Did we look at existing plans and policies? There's several different things we looked at. An example of one of these, let's just look briefly at 1.2 as an example. So that specific criteria was providing access to parks and open spaces. So we wanted to determine the level for each segment, each of those 60 segments, the level to which it provided access for all ages and abilities to parks and open spaces, and within those parks and open spaces. So as an example of the metrics for that, if a trail segment connected directly to a park or between parks or open spaces or within that park, it would receive a high rating. If it didn't connect whatsoever, it would get a low rating, and there was a gradient in between where it might get a medium rating, for example. So every single one of the 17 individual criteria that we had, we went through this process, figuring out the description, figuring out the metrics for that rating. We went through all of those. What you see here is a snapshot of that table where we've actually added ratings. Every trail segment is represented by a column. Actually, only 15 of the 60 actually show up on the screen. It's obviously not intended to be read at the scale. It's just to show you an example. The specific criteria were all the rows in that spreadsheet. Only 4 of the 17 actually fit on this snapshot. So you can see, how big this spreadsheet really was, how many ratings we had to do. The colors were assigned to the different ratings. So a good or a high rating was given a green color, medium or average a yellow, and poor or low a red. This helped us spatially track these, and as you'll see in a moment, it relates to the mapping that we did. There was also a numerical value given to each one of the ratings, so 3 for good, 2 for average, and 1 for low. This is important because as we move along, some of the criteria were averaged when creating maps grouped together, and so we needed to be able to give those numerical values. So here we continue to zoom out. You can see the breadth of the spreadsheet. There's, because there are 60 segments and 17 criteria, that's over 1,000 data points that we had to rate. You can see the color variations in that. It's hard to tell from the table. So obviously the next step is translating this into some maps. We got a comment from one of our working group members during this review process. And before I read the comment, I think it's an appropriate comment, a good analogy. This process went through many different steps. We obviously had to create, the criteria and the ratings and all that. We worked that out with the county and the working group. We actually did a test sample where we took 10 representative trail segments and said, okay, let's see how this rating system works, and went through those. We brought it back to the group. We kind of worked out the bugs. We went back out and then rated all 60 of the segments, came back to the group, had discussions about those ratings, and they were reviewed. We shifted some ratings around. So it was a very kind of iterative working process. The comment by the working group member that I thought was good was, maybe it's the color choices in the spreadsheet, but the 60 or so segment rankings bring to mind a box of number 2 fruit. The sizes vary considerably, but despite the blemishes, most are edible, with the exception of a few soft ones. And I agree with the suggested toss-outs. He went on to say that some of the ratings could actually shift a half a point one way or the other, but because we didn't use half-point ratings, that wasn't something we were going to do. He said, even though in his mind they could shift a half a point one way or the other, that overall the change in results would have been significant. So that's appropriate. It's important also to keep in mind that this is still a qualitative process, not a quantitative one, even though we've assigned some numerical values. The intent wasn't to create some fancy mathematical formula, plug in the values, press a button, and have the computer tell us what we needed to do. The intent really was figure out a way to take all these ratings and create tools or maps to be able to use those to have discussions with each other about what segments were optimal, what segments weren't as optimal, and those that weren't optimal, how to mitigate those. So what do we do with these, 1,000 data points, all these colored rating boxes on the table? How do we make sense of it all? Like I said, we decided to do that through mapping. So spatially representing those ratings so that we could begin to see what the optimal segments were and where the weak links were within the system. Instead of mapping all 17 individual criteria, you can imagine toggling through or switching through 17 different maps and trying to compare and contrast and figure out, with all these different colored lines, try to make sense of those. And so what we did is we mapped, we created these mapping tools based generally on the category. Some of the maps are based on specific individual criteria. Some of them are amalgamation, an average of criteria within a category. But we created the maps we felt would be most useful to help answer the questions that we had about this potential trail system. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go briefly through the specific criteria and then how the ratings for those criteria translated into specific maps. This might feel a little bit redundant because I used this one as an example early on, but the first category was connecting communities, parks, and open spaces. So we looked at specific criteria for whether the trail provided access to communities, access to parks and open spaces. Was that segment consistent with adopted policies and plans of the county? And were there places of interest along the trail? The mapping that we did relative to this was based specifically on criteria 1.1 and 1.2, whether it provided access to communities, parks, and open spaces. You can see looking at this map, the green and red. On this particular map, we decided to do a binary result, so it either met the criteria or did not meet the criteria. So you can see here the pattern, obviously, through the middle on these are that those that are more optimal are the ones that connect parks and open spaces. And just for a little context on this map, North Kitsap Heritage Park, actually, use this little here, is this. The divide block is this piece of land outlined in black, and the Great Peninsula Conservancy's Grover's Creek Preserve is this kind of lightish bluish green blocks there. So those trail segments that actually connected parks and open spaces or were within parks and open spaces got a higher rating in this map. Those that didn't got a lower rating. It's important to reiterate here that on these maps, just because something gets a red designation doesn't mean that it's tossed out or disqualified. It simply means that for this criteria, for this map, those routes are considered suboptimal. So the next criteria, which is environmental, we're actually going to have Phil Struck, our team's biologist, come up and talk about the process and the mapping for this particular category of criteria.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, everybody. My name is Phil Struck. I'm an environmental scientist, and I prepare the environmental tier 1 analysis. I've got a few slides here that talk about the criteria, the scoring and how it was done, and then a little bit about how environmental information is being used in the overall evaluation of the alternatives. Our criteria, as you've probably seen through the various maps and online information, 6 basic criteria: habitat, connectivity, and fragmentation that could result from a path in that segment, wetland, stream, and buffer impacts from a path crossing through or over those features. And finally, restoration potential, which would apply to a segment that has some feature that might be restored by the project
project. Examples being a fish passage barrier culvert that might be replaced, or a stand of dense invasive vegetation that might be replaced with native plantings. So why these criteria and how is the assessment done? Well, for the most part, the criteria reflect regulatory standards for critical areas. Examples being, what is allowed in a certain type of wetland, what is allowed for crossing a certain type of stream, what are mitigation requirements, buffer requirements, etc. As Jeff mentioned, we use existing mapping. We use the wetland report that was done for the Heritage Park. The wetland report done for the divide feasibility study, in local and state and national inventories, and then supplemented that with some on-site assessments to kind of fill in the gaps with some of those higher level assessments, maybe to get down to the level of detail that we're trying to get to with this study. So our tier 1 ratings reflect both the approximate quantity of the impact, that's how much of the critical areas being affected, as well as the quality of the resource, like the sensitivity or unique nature of the wetland, how many, the number of fish that are in a particular stream. So how is it being applied? Environmental criteria is not weighted any more or any less than any other criteria, and that's really in consideration the framework that we're using, which is kind of considering the project purpose. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll start over. So the environmental criteria is not weighted more or less than any other criteria in tier 1. And that reflects our approach, which is considering environmental information in context of the overall project purpose and objectives, as well as realizing that virtually all the routes and alternatives have some degree of impact and mitigation requirements. And really the goal of the environmental assessment is really to characterize the environmental information to really support identification of what we're calling practicable and reasonable alternatives. And those two terms are defined in local, state, and federal regulations that are really the standard framework for how to integrate environmental information into an alternatives analysis such as this. So this map depicts the average of the criteria applied to the segments. Red being higher impact, green lower impact. Maybe to contrast a couple segments to show how this was done, this segment right here, segment B5, going through the GPC property, goes through a forested wetland bog, very kind of rare and unique and very sensitive wetland system. Very difficult to mitigate impacts in that system that received a very low score. Like in contrast, maybe the West Kingston Road here between Norham and Miller Bay also had some significant impacts due to crossing half a dozen wetlands and a stream, but was not scored as low because the quality of those wetlands was not quite as high as the one in segment B5. So that just illustrates one example of how it was done. So with that, turn it back over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So the next category of criteria, so we've talked about two, we have three left. The third category is safety, health, and function. Specific criteria that we looked at for that included user safety and health, user vehicle conflicts at driveways, and user vehicle conflicts at roadways. When we looked at the average ratings for these three criteria, you can start to see some patterns emerge. Obviously, roadways, pathways, separated pathways associated with roadways typically are less optimal. So you're seeing yellows and reds there. This is due to their proximity. It's due to traffic volumes, traffic speed, the number of driveways that would need to be crossed within those road corridors. You can see trails that are within parks and open spaces generally were rated higher for this particular category. The fourth category of criteria was user experience. This included specific criteria for low stress path design, meeting ADA criteria in the built condition, and the quality of the outdoor experience. I want to explain a little bit what meeting ADA criteria in the built condition is. These segments were rated based on their potential, not existing. This is obviously an early planning study, not a design and engineering study. So we had to look at each segment on the piece of land that it was on, whether the trail existed or didn't, look at the topography, look at other constraints, and try to come to a consensus on what the potential for a design on that segment was that would actually meet ADA criteria. What's interesting about this map, and we actually created two maps for this particular category, one specifically for accessibility. We thought that this was important to look at. What's interesting is you'll notice that almost all of the major roads are green. That's because a separated path technically is allowed to follow the slope of that road, even if that road is steep. While that might meet ADA requirements, that may not necessarily be optimal for user experience, and you'll see that in the next map. You can see some of the other items on here related to accessibility. There's some small steep segments within North Kitsap Heritage Park. If you've hiked those, you know that from personal experience. Power line trail, which is between the park and the golf course, and the potential trail through the privately owned gravel pit. There's also three pretty steep segments to the west side of Miller Bay Road, ascending up into the divide block, two of them through GPC property. So those were the challenges for this particular criteria. We also mapped the average of user experience for criteria 4.1 and 4.3. This was based also on topography, but with user experience in mind, as well as the trail's location, as well as the quality of the outdoor experience adjacent to that trail. What's interesting about this map here is that it's kind of the inverse from when you look at the roads. The user experience is less optimal here due to noise, due to volume, due to proximity to those roads. Whereas trail segments through parks and open spaces generally were rated as more optimal. With the exception, you can see a few on there, you know, within the park, these yellows and some of these other ones were rated lower. They got bumped down because of the steepness and the ability to actually design those in such a way that they'd be enjoyable, showed those as not as optimal. So there's not time for questions during the presentation. After the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to have discussions and ask questions around the different boards in the back. It's not wanting to forward again. Okay, so the last criteria category is project delivery. That included things such as cost, so design and construction costs, as well as mitigation and restoration costs. It also took into consideration right-of-ways and easement issues associated with those trail segments. For this criteria, right-of-ways and easements, trail segments that were associated with land that potentially had to be acquired or needed an easement or was in a right-of-way, typically was rated less optimally than segments that did not need that. On this project, we've identified some willing partners. Those include Rainier, which used to be Pope. In the divide block, Great Peninsula Conservancy, which owns and manages the Grover's Creek Preserve, and Kitsap County Parks. And so trails within within parks and open spaces typically had higher ratings. Land that is controlled by, say, WashDOT, for example, the tribes and other private property owners that we haven't had a chance to consult with yet, typically received lower ratings due to the unknowns and due to the risk associated with those trail segments.
And one of the other aspects of the right-of-way is a lot of people have considerations about the North Kitsap Heritage Park Phase 2 acquisitions and the RCO. We were hoping to have a definitive determination by tonight, but Parks and RCO have not finalized their discussions that went through. And so we are still showing it as a yellow within the, within the criteria map. It is an area that has a potential easement or right-of-way question as we went through. And we have designed that go through. Because each one of the RCO or the Recreation and Conservation Office has a number of different types of grants, and identifying where those grants are specific to what properties and what those restrictions might be and impacting the Sound Olympics Trail or design going through there is still a question. As soon as we can have that definitive answer, we will be posting it to the website as we went through. But again, we are working very hard, or parks, I should say, because one thing for these determinations is the project is not making these discussions or determination on the availability of property or restrictions on property. Just the property owners, in this case, parks, as the property owner, the managers of those properties, is working with RCO to determine their obligations are not under any specific criteria moving forward that's associated with the acquisitions.
Thanks, David. Okay, so we've now completed looking at the specific criteria, the mapping associated with each of that. In summary, we created these different maps to be able to see what routes were more optimal, which segments possibly had issues. We decided to create one more map. Still, we found as with the working group and as a project team, we found flipping through these maps, still with these 6, it was still hard to see patterns emerge. And so we created a map that was basically a combination or a filter of these other maps. We determined that everything that was a low rating for any segment in the previous maps would be shown as black on this map. That anything above that low rating would be shown as green on this particular map. The goal being to be able to see patterns start to emerge and to see those combinations of optimal links and where there were weak links. So this shows specific areas that we looked at in more detail. We spent some considerable time looking at these 5 or 6, what I'm calling gaps or weak links. The question we need to ask ourselves through the study of these is, what are the most suitable weak links in order to connect these segments of green or more optimal links so that we actually have a trail from point A to point B. Sorry for the delay. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned I was going to talk about 2 main things: the process, which we've just completed, and then the results, or what alignments we're going to look at further for a study in phase 2 of this analysis. We reviewed the criteria maps, we focused on connections, and we discussed options and alternative routes with working group members, and that led us to the alternatives for further study in phase 2. Those are represented by the blue lines. Now, there's not three distinctly different alignments here. And you'll notice kind of a jumble of blue lines. Essentially what's happened through the rating process is that we've eliminated about 40% of the segments from tier one, and the remainder of the segments we'll be looking at in the context of an actual alignment in phase two. And what you'll see in a moment is remember at the beginning of the presentation, we looked at the project area, there's the west, the central, and east zone. Well, we'll zoom into those and look at those enlargements, because within each one of those enlargements, you'll be able to begin to see what the three different options are. And there's a possibility within those three zones that different alignments may be optimal, and we can link those three together. Before we do that, though, it was determined by the project team at the county that one of the three options would actually be a road-only option. So from Port Gamble Forest Heritage Park, the star on the left, it would utilize the roadway corridors of Stottlemyre, Gunderson, Miller Bay Road, and West Kingston Road. While somewhat circuitous, this one does have the advantage of linking to the main spine of the STO that'll be coming up from Polsbo and linking in at Stottlemyre and Gunderson. This one also would provide access to North Kitsap Heritage Park parking lot, as well as Grover's Creek Preserve and any trails that might be in there in the future. So let's look at each of these zones and look at three potential options within each one of those. This is the west zone. So option one, this is the road only option I just mentioned. So utilizing Stottlemyre and Gunderson to Miller Bay Road. This one actually goes up Stottlemyre and crosses under Highway 104 in a new tunnel. It then heads east and runs up, ascends up into the divide block in a route that was identified during the 2015 feasibility study. It then descends back down through the divide block and GPC property towards A&L Topsoil, if you know where that is, on Orseth Road to Miller Bay Road. The third option for this zone, instead of going underneath the highway at 104, would travel up Stottlemyre to the existing signal, cross the highway there, run south on Port Gamble Road. It would then turn east and ascend up into the divide block via Gratitude Way, and then descend back down the east side, the same segment to Orseth Road and Miller Bay Road. So that was the west zone. The central zone, the first option here is utilizing the road only option, Miller Bay Road to West Kingston Road. The second option runs from the end of Orseth Road on Miller Bay Road up into the park to the Spineline Trail, back down the east side of the park and crossing over the Beaver Pond at the existing embankment. I should explain this interesting symbol, the blue arrows there, means that there's some flexibility in that wedge or that triangle that's created by those three yellow lines that due to potential land acquisitions, topography, the phase 2 study would look at that as an option to get from Orseth Road and Miller Bay Road up to the top of the park, not necessarily utilizing this link or this link, but maybe there's an opportunity within here to get up to the top of the park. The third option from Orseth Road runs a short distance up Miller Bay Road to the parking lot, the existing parking lot within the park, utilizing the northern portion of the park to cross the park. It's much more flat, although there are wetland buffer issues that would need to be mitigated. And once again, crossing the Beaver Pond on the east side of the park. So now moving to the east zone, this is the road only option using West Kingston Road. The second option, exiting the park to the north towards Norman Road and then cutting off to the east in county property where the treatment plant is located, running north in undeveloped private property to West Kingston Road. And then at this point, really, the trail would utilize existing roadside infrastructure, bike lanes, essentially, to get into town and to the ferry. The third option, instead of going north out of the park at the Beaver Pond, would actually head south into the Arborwood neighborhood that's under development. They're required by the county to put a shared use trail within that neighborhood. Some of it's actually already built. So that runs up to South Kingston Way, over the inlet to West Kingston Road and into town. So the next steps, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to look at these alignments that I just showed you, the 3 options in each zone. We're going to do a more detailed analysis of those alignments. Instead of individual segments, we're going to be looking at full alignments. We have additional criteria that we're going to assess these alignments using. It's going to be a more quantitative analysis versus the qualitative one we did to get to this point. Hopefully by the end of that, we'll have determined a preferred alignment or preferred alternative, and we'll be presenting that to you later this summer in the 3rd public open house. So that concludes our presentation. You want me to go over the slide? So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to go to the back of the room. We're going to spread out around the maps. We're going to use that opportunity. We felt it would be more productive to actually speak around the maps. There'll be county staff as well as consultants around each board. If you have questions, you can ask them there. If you have specific statements or comments that you want to make, you can provide those to the county via the link on their website. I think there might also be an opportunity. Is there a box at back for these comments?
No, actually, that's one. Is that in our rush that we did forget our comment sheets. So we'll have to electronically as we go through. Also, the website, we'll be posting the presentation and the websites, the final alternatives to the maps to the website for the next couple of days. Give us a little time to do some technical things to put everything up on the web as part of that. And also, we'd like to give a thanks to the Kingston Greens here, is that they did some stellar work to get us to work today, because when we came in, their overhead projector was out. And so they were scrambling to try and get us the setup where we get a nice presentation going forward, including calling in the fire department to provide some AV, they were from high school, the AV people that came and saved us to have a nice presentation as we went forward. So we'll be setting up staff in the back as part of that to answer questions. You have in your seat a little yellow takeaway that is the website as part of that, where you'll be able to see all the analysis that we just put out here. We have changed it. You may the criteria file we initially set up there. Our website wouldn't allow us to actually, we tried to put up an Excel spreadsheet up there to allow you to easily maneuver through it. It took our IT a little bit of time to make it work. So we did provide some instructions on how to pull down that criteria as an Excel spreadsheet. It's right on the instructions are right on a PDF link right there that helps you do that. So that allows you, there's also a PDF of the maps themselves, and the interactive map will all show the things. We'll have all the updates with the preferred alternative in a day or two, and they'll be available on the website. And so we're going to be moving to the back and be available to answer your questions. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it.